Moadim l'simcha, everybody. I hope you are having a beautiful, redemptive Pesach. You are in dinanddaf, in case you've lost track of where you are. There's a lot going on, certainly. I do want to say that the shiur that we are going to learn now, I want to dedicate to our hostages who are still in the hands of Hamas and other terror groups. I probably, like most, if not all of you, was very touched, saddened, worried, filled with hope and possibility at seeing the video of Hirsch Goldberg Poland still alive, and just want to learn some Torah in the merit of the freedom of his freedom and all the other hostages. May they come back soon and as whole as possible. Bezrat Hashem. So this topic that we're going to talk about today is ostensibly about the relationship between ona'at mammon and ona'at devarim, right? Ona'at mammon we talked about last week, essentially duping someone financially by overcharging them or by underpaying. And that clearly is something that relates to finances, right? Even though we saw that perhaps biblically the lashon of ona'ah is actually the lashon of oppression rather than financial trickery of any sort. But certainly rabbinically, we understand the Torah to be talking about oppression with money in the manner of trickery. Ona'at devarim is really interesting because it does seem to have both the sense of oppression and the sense of trickery, right? It's ona'at devarim to suggest that you would be looking to buy something when you're not looking to buy something, or inviting someone to an event that you know they can't come to, but you make them think that you want them to be there. And that's sort of very similar to ona'at mammon. And then there's also just the oppressive piece, which is kind of reminding somebody of a past that they don't want to be reminded of. Telling somebody, oh, well, you used to transgress such and such of a road, or, you come from a background that you might not want to be talking about right now. And it's sort of a way of uh, oppressing someone with words. What I think is very interesting, actually, is the Gemara in Bava Metzia Nun Chet Amud Bet talks about the relationship between what we might have called it the relationship between money and words, but the Gemara actually characterizes it as the relationship between mammon and guf, right? The way the Gemara puts it on Nun Chet Amud Bet is Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that gadol ona'at devarim me ona'at mammon, ona'at devarim, oppressing with words, is greater than oppressing financially, which presumably means it's a worse sin. שזה נאמר בו ויראתם אלוקיך, וזה לא נאמר בו ויראתם אלוקיך. Because when it comes to ona'at devarim, the Torah says, V'yareta mi elokecha, you should fear your God. But when it comes to ona'at mammon, the Torah does not say that. Now, where exactly does the Torah say V'yareta mi elokecha when it comes to ona'at devarim and not ona'at mammon? So I'll go back to my son's bar mitzvah parsha that he is practicing. Or, right, last week we learned from Bahar v'chitiv kirim kar lamitecha, o kano miyad mitecha al tonu ish et achiv. If you are selling something or buying something, you cannot do ona'ah financially, overcharging or underpaying. That's clearly about money. And then the next two psukim describe, that's Vayikra Kaf He Yudalid, describe, okay, so when you're buying a piece of land or selling a piece of land, you should make sure that the payment is related to how many years are left before the next Yovel, when the land will have to return. But then there's a kind of a summation pasuk in pasuk Yud Zayin that says v'lo tonu ishet amito, and a person should not oppress their fellow. V'yareta me'elokecha, you should fear God, ki ani Hashem Elokechem, because I am the Lord your God. And Chazal, as you know from learning the daf, learn out that last pasuk v'lo tonu ishet amito, v'yareta me'elokecha, ki ani Hashem Elokechem, is about ona'at devarim. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Clearly, ona'at devarim is worse in some way than ona'at mammon. It's a greater sin because one tells you, fear God. Now, maybe that's implying that there's something very serious about it, even more serious. But then other answers are also given why ona'at mammon might be the lesser of the two evils of ona'at devarim and ona'at mammon. Rabbi Elazar, says, ze begufo, ze b'mamona. The difference is the reason why ona'at devarim is so much worse is because ona'at devarim is begufo, whereas ona'at mammon is with someone's money. Now, this is interesting because we might have thought when something says the sin is in someone's goof, in someone's body, you think we're talking about like you physically hit them. What we mean here is that you are actually engaging someone's personhood and not just their money, right? When you say, oh, you used to, the mouth that learns Torah, a mouth that used to eat all sorts of non-kosher things should be learning Torah, right? What you're doing is you're attacking the person. You're not just swindling them financially. And so attacking the person, gufo, the attack on the person is worse, right? Rami Shmuel Bar Nachmani adds his own reason. When it comes to ona'at mammon, you can give the money back. Ona'at devarim, you can't give the money back, which, by the way, may be an explanation of why the guf is worse than the mammon in this case, right? Because it's talking about you've attacked a person's personhood. And we'll just leave it at that, right? But suffice it to say, this assumption of doing something to someone's goof, and here it seems what we mean is doing something to their person or their personhood is worse than just doing something to their money. The truth is that if you look throughout Sifrut Chazal, if you look throughout rabbinic literature, you will actually find this conversation about a person's, I keep wanting just calling it a person's person, right? Because then it doesn't just have to be your body. It can also be your emotions. It can also be your sense of identity and your sense of self, right? It can be inclusive. But you find over and over again a comparison between mammon and goof. And often goof is deemed to be much more weighty, we would say, right? So I want to give us a few examples of where it's considered more weighty. And not surprising, Rabbi Elazar, the same person who is cited here as explaining that ona'at devarim is worse than ona'at mammon because it's an offense against personhood. He is also cited elsewhere as talking about how doing something good with your personhood is, even more laudatory than doing something with just your. So I'm going to share my screen here and I'll take a look at this, right? We have the gemara in Brachot, Va'amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, same Rabbi Elazar, Gedolat ta'anit yoter min hatzdaka. Ta'anit, fasting, is greater than giving charity. My taima, why? Ze begufo v'ze b'mamono. Because when you fast, you do so with your full person. And I'm going to say here it really does mean with your body. Whereas when you give tzedakah, you are doing something only, quote unquote, financially. What's interesting here is you have Rabbi Elazar in both places. So I have a few questions, right? Meaning one question I could ask is was it just a known thing that Rabbi Elazar thought that in general, actions with the self or against the self or using the self were more significant, meaning more laudatory if they were good and more punishable if they were bad than actions relating to finances? And then the editors of the Gemara connected that to both the case of ta'anit, where you're fasting and you're using your body, and the case of ona'at devarim, where it's not about the body, but it's about the person. Or perhaps is it possible that Rabbi Elazar actually said gufo and mamono when it came to the actual goof of fasting, and then the editors related it to the idea of offending someone's goof, not literally their goof in ona'at devarim, but their personhood, and they kind of expanded it beyond. So that would be hard to know. But suffice it to say, what we do have is we have two examples. One where you did something bad to somebody's goof, ona'at devarim, meaning you've insulted their personhood. The other where you've done something good using your goof, literally bodily. And in both places, Rabbi Elazar seems to say that it is a weightier thing that you have done. Now, of course, this is going to have ramifications on the way that we think about people's emotional well-being versus their financial well-being, the way we think about, people investing of themselves and their time and their energy versus investing their finances. But we'll get more on that later. But certainly that's one way that this shows up. Another way that this conversation about the goof and the mammon shows up is actually in a conversation that shows up even earlier in the Mishnah, which is related actually to last week's parsha, to Parsha Metzora, to the situation where somebody's house may have tzarat, and the Torah says, "Vitziva hakohen ufinu et habayit." The Kohen tells everybody, we need to empty this house out, essentially before we make a pronouncement that this house is tameh. And the Mishnah in Negaim, Perek Yud Bet Mishnah Hey, discusses this issue. And what comes up in context of that is this question of mammon and goof. So let me share my screen with you. Okay. So ketzad ri'iyat habayit. How does it work when a Kohen is looking at a house to determine whether it has tzarat? Uva asher lo habayit v'higid lakohen lemor kinega yireh li babayit. Right? So first thing, we are citing right from the Torah. The person who owns the house goes to the Kohen and says, there's some nega-like thing, there's some plague-like thing that's on my house. Afilu talmid chacham v'yodea shehu nega vadai lo yigzor v'yomar nega nir'ali babayit ella ke nega nir'ali babayit. Even if the owner of the house is a great Torah scholar and knows that this is sarat, that person themselves should not be making the decree that is sarat. Rather, they should go to the Kohen and say, ke nega nir'ali babayit. It's like some sort of plague, meaning the Kohen's going to have to make the decision. And hence, Torah says ke nega. And then, continuing to quote from the Torah, v'tziva hakohen ufinu et habayit, right? And the Kohen is going to command everybody to clean out the house, right? And this is b'terem yavo hakohen lirot et hanega, right? This is before the Kohen is going to go see the nega, v'lo yitma kol asher babayit, so that not everything in the house becomes tameh. Because if you left the things in the house, they would become tameh. And then the pasuk says, "V'achar ken yavo hakohen lirot et habayit." Then the Kohen goes to see the house, right? Now, they're clearing out everything from the house, right? Now, what does it mean? Everything. So the Mishnah continues, "Va'afilu chavilei etzim, va'afilu chavilei kanim." Tivri Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you even take bundles of wood and bundles of reeds out of the house. Rabbi Shimon Omer, esek hula pinui. Rabbi Shimon says this is going to be something that keeps a person occupied. Second. Sorry, I just got stuck on my computer. Sorry about that. And what he means, it seems, is he's basically saying, look, you don't need to taking out chavilei etzim and chavilei kanim. These are called pshutei kliates. They're not going to become tameh. So why do you have to be taking these things out? Rabbi Shimon says, I think I accidentally just said Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon says, sorry if I did. Rabbi Shimon says, Esek ulapinui. The Torah says, ufinu atabayit, spend time clearing out the house, right? Like that might be something separate from below yitmakol asher babayit, right? Below yitmakol asher babayit is for the stuff that could become tameh and you're taking it out. And ufinu atabayit is take out everything, even the chabilei etzim, even the chabilei kanim, even though they won't become tameh. Now comes Rabbi Meir. Sorry, Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, "V'chi ma'metamelo." I don't understand. What's the big deal? Like, what's going to become permanently tameh here? Im tomar, if you say kleitzav uvegadav umatchotav, if you say what we're worried about is the person's kalim that are made of wood or made of cloth or made of metal, then so what if they become tameh if the house has tzarat? Matbilan vehin torim. Just immerse them in a mikvah and they become tahor. So Almachas Torah, what was the Torah so worried about? What was the Torah trying to protect by saying, empty everything out of the house before it becomes tameh? Al klei cherso ve'al pacho ve'al tifio. The Torah was worried about a person's earthenware, the cheapest stuff that a person has. Meaning, even that stuff. Why? Because earthenware, you can't be mitaheret. You have to break it, right? That's how you're mitaheret. You break it. But that stuff is so cheap. And so the Mishnah says, and here comes, the mammon and goof stuff. Mishnah says, Im kachas Torah al mammonu habazui, if the Torah is so careful, even to protect a person's cheap possessions, that before you declare a house to have tzarat, you take out everything, including the earthenware. Kal v'chomer al mamono chaviv. How much more so would the Torah want to protect a person's more precious possessions? And then im kach al mamono, if the Torah wanted to protect a person's possessions so much, kal v'chomer al nefesh banav uvnotav. How much more would the Torah want to protect someone's children? Right now, that's not gufo, but it's sort of gufo in a way, right? How much more would the Torah want to protect someone's children? Im kach al shel rasha, if the Torah was willing to protect all this stuff for a rasha, meaning somebody who obviously did something wrong and that's why they got tzara out of the house, kal v'chomer al shel tzaddik. How much more so would the Torah want to protect all the possessions and children of a tzaddik, of someone who is righteous? So I think that Mishnah is a really interesting indication, kind of earlier indication than the Gemara that we looked at or the Gemara in Brachot, that there is an understanding that your money is important, but it's not as important as your goof. Now, what does your goof mean? Does your goof mean literally your body? Does your goof mean your household, meaning your children? Does your goof mean your feelings, your status, your sense of self, your emotional? Okay, so you see it coming in different ways. But to me, the most interesting hashlacha or example, most interesting case where the Gemara, or that I've encountered, I should say, where Chazal talk about the difference between guf and mammon, is not the situation that we see in Bava Metzia, where you're doing something to somebody's guf, meaning their person, through ona'at devarim, is worse than doing something to their mammon, ona'at mammon. Not the situation in brachot, where doing something bodily, like a ta'anit, that is worthy, is better, or maybe more effective, maybe it even means, than tzedakah, than charity, because that's only with your mammon, right? And it's not even, do we protect the Mishnah and Negaim, does the Torah protect, if the Torah protects a person's money, kal v'chomer, the Torah would protect their, children, who I'm thinking of as an extension of goof in a certain way. But to me, the most interesting example is the Gemara in Yoma, okay? The Gemara in Yoma, Kav Bet Amud Bet, talks about, and it's very interesting to note that it's Rabbi Yochanan again, even though it's Rabbi Yochanan in the name of somebody else, but it's still interesting to note, like Rabbi Yochanan does actually make a lot of comments in the Bavli. I don't know if this is matched in the Yerushalmi, but he does make a lot of comments about people's emotional lives and reactions, right? He's the same, you know, you have it in the Gemara on Daf Nuntet Amud Aleph. You probably read it already. That better to commit adultery than to be malbin pnei chaver b'rabim, right? Rabbi Yochanan has all these interesting things. I actually wrote a piece in the new Rabbi Sachs book about joy. I think it's called Ode to Joy. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. All these short 3 to 5 page essays on joy from different aspects. Very helpful in a time like this when you're sort of feeling less than joyful, where I compare Rabbi Yochanan's statements about being malbin b'nei chavero to another statement where he talks about God being, or the importance of being malbin shinayim, the importance of smiling at someone, and that being more important than feeding them necessarily. But it's for a different time. So the Gemara in Yom, I'm going to share it with you. Kaf bet amud bet. Kaf bet amud bet, kaf gimel amud aleph. Right, it goes like this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak. So Rabbi Yochanan says the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak. Kol Tamid Chacham she'enu nokem v'noter kenachash. Any Talmud Chacham who does not take revenge and bear a grudge like a serpent, Tamid Chacham, is not considered a Talmid Chacham. What? Who? What? Where? Why? So the context here is talking about the fact that, Shaul didn't stand on ceremony when people insulted him, and he should have known better, and he should have actually, because of his dignity as a king and a political figure, he should have stood on ceremony. So maybe a Talmid Chacham also is supposed to say, be vengeful because they represent something. I don't know. It's a surprising ma'amar. And the Gemara itself is surprised, right? So the editors ask, but doesn't it say lo tikom v'lo titor? Right? The Torah says you're not supposed to take revenge. You're not supposed to bear a grudge. Look at this. So the Gemara says, no. Ahu mammon hu dichtiv. Lo tikom v'lo titor, you can't take revenge, is referring to a case of money. As opposed to, we'll see in a minute. Titania, as we learned in a Breita, ezuhi nikima ve'ezuhi netira. What is considered taking revenge? What is considered bearing a grudge? Nikima, taking revenge. Amarlo, a person says, Hashileni magalecha, magalcha, lend me your sickle. Amarlo lav, the person says no. Lamachar, amarlo hu, the next day, the person who said no says, Hashileni kardumcha, can you lend me your shovel? Amarlo, nope, eini mashelcha, I'm not going to lend it to you. Kiderek shaloi shaltani, just like you didn't lend it to me. Zohi nikima, that is taking revenge, right? You're, you won't scratch my back, I won't scratch yours. Ve'ezuhi netira, what is bearing a grudge? Amarlo hashileni kardumcha, somebody says to another, let me borrow your shovel. Amarlo, lo, the person says no. Amachar, amarlo, the next day, that person who had said no says hashileni chalukcha, let me borrow your, your outfit, your jacket. Amarlo, he says, hey, lach, you can have it, right? So it's not an eye for an eye, right? You can have it, it's fine, but you should know, I'm not like you who wouldn't lend it to me, right? So even though you're willing to lend it, you make sure that they realize that you're bearing a grudge for the fact that they didn't lend something to you. Zohi netira, right? That is bearing a grudge. So the only way the Gemara says lo tikom v'lo titor only applies in a case of mammon. What's a case of mammon? Somebody didn't lend you something yesterday and you decide not to lend them. Sorry, that's not allowed. But what is allowed? Sounds like what is allowed is if somebody insulted you, you're allowed to insult them back. If somebody did something to you, bagoof, in the sense of, emotionally, you're allowed to take revenge or bear a grudge. And by the way, the next line in the Gemara says, Vitsara de gufa lo, is it true that if somebody causes you tsar of the goof, and it's likely not talking about physically they hit you, it's talking more about this emotional. Is it true that if somebody causes you tsar of your person, you're allowed to take revenge, that the isser of taking revenge doesn't apply? What? Tanya, don't we have a Breita that says Hanel Avin ve'enan ovin those who are able to be insulted and don't insult back, right? Sounds like we're not talking about somebody punched you. We're talking about somebody said something mean to you, right? That's Sa'ar Haguf here. Shomin Cherpatan Beinan Meshivin, people who are able to hear, humiliation of themselves and they don't answer. Osin me'ahava usmechin b'yisurin, who do so out of love and are even happy with this painful consequence, which is a topic for a different shiur, I think. Alein hakatuv omer, about those people, doesn't scripture say v'ohavav kitzei tashemesh b'gvurato, right? Those who love God are, as bright as when the sun, shines, right? Meaning the Gemara basically says, well, you're not supposed to do nikima nitira for tsar haguf either. You're not supposed to do if somebody insults you. Don't we have a braita that says better to be the person who gets insulted than the person who and doesn't insult back than a person who insults back, right? Better not to answer, right? So the Gemara goes on and figures out ways to work it out. But it's kind of shocking, and this is why I love this Gemara, because I find it fascinating, that it seems to be that there is a suggestion that, listen, when it comes to your mammon, if somebody does something bad to you, they aren't going to lend to you. You can't take revenge or bear a grudge. If they come and they ask you for something, you got to give it to them. Now, I might offer a logic because that's what's going to make the world go round, right? You can't just, people won't lend to each other anymore. But if they do tsar haguf to you, if they do something that insults you emotionally, then feel free to bear a grudge and feel free to take revenge. Now, we're not saying it's lipsak halakha, but it's really interesting that this is a suggestion. It's almost like the Gemara recognizes that, like, when somebody does something mean to you, not just won't lend you something, but they say something that's hurtful to you, they insult you, they humiliate you, that either maybe the Torah can't tell you not to do nikima nitira because it's superhuman, or maybe like the original comment about a Talmid Chacham having to be nokeim v'noter k'nachash, that actually when your dignity is insulted, you should say something back, right? And then here it's tempered at the end of the Gemara. It's tempered with, but the better thing is actually not to answer. And that's, it's not productive. And let's not go in these directions and be humble and all the things. But it's still a great example of tsar mammon and tsar haguf. So where does that leave us? Well, all this leaves us with, first of all, at the very least, it is clear that Chazal see a difference in many different ways between someone's possessions and someone's person, whether their emotions or their physical body. And the most precious thing we have is ourselves, more precious than all of our possessions. And I can't think of a better chag. I can't think of a better chag for that message than Pesach, both in terms of ourselves getting our gufot back from slavery, and also because of this incredible isser on chametz that isn't just an isser of don't eat it. It's an isser of don't own it. And it isn't even just an isser of don't own it. It's an isser of don't get any benefit from it, right? It's like we literally alienate ourselves from something that is a possession of ours throughout the year. And it's actually a humbling experience. And it should be a humbling experience, right? That like our mammon is not all that we are about. But the second thing I would say is that I think it's really interesting to consider the relationship between mammon and guf. I skipped over it, but in number 2, the Balei Tosfot on our Gemara, they cite a Gemara elsewhere that you learned probably in Bava Kama, Daf Kuf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, where the Gemara said, "Haguza lechavero shavepruta ki'ilu gazal nishmato." Someone who steals a pruta's worth from someone else, it's as though they've stolen their soul. And Tosfot is like, how can you tell me that doing something to someone's goof is worse than doing something to someone's mammon when that Gemara said doing something to someone's mammon is like you're stealing their whole neshama. And so Tosfot come up with a way like, oh, well, maybe what we're talking about is sort of this person's last dollar and they're very hungry. And in that case, it was actually stealing their mammon was stealing their goof, right? But I do think in our day and age, it's worth thinking about like, on the one hand, it's like we say our possessions aren't as important as ourselves, which is true, right? Our possessions aren't as important as our children. But on the other hand, in some ways, the way we use our money is an extension of us, right? It is an extension of who we are. It shows what our values are. It shows kind of what our identities are. So it's just interesting. I think it's worth it instead of wrapping it up in a bow to just say, okay, obviously our goof is more important than our mammon. I just think it's worth opening the question and the issue, right? Like, how tied together is my emotional well being to the salary that I'm able to make and how I'm able to spend my money, right? And how many times do I get caught up in that? And then how many times do I actually see the distinction between those two? I just think it's worth thinking about. So as you are eating your matzah or your matzah brai or your non-gebracht or whatever it is you're eating, let us pray. Benisan nigalu, benisan atidin ligael. Bezrat Hashem, we should see gufot of living, breathing, whole people return to us. And soon, soon, soon.